Welcome, everybody. We'll have some folks filtering in, but thank you so much for joining today. My name is Ellie Grapp. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Regional Training Director for the Mountain Midwest Hub. We run a series of webinars. We try to do it monthly-ish of kind of learnings that are supplemental to maybe things that you're experiencing with YUSA trainings and just things that we find are relevant based on feedback that we're getting from the movement. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Laure, who is the founder of Positive Force Movement. They've been an educator around equity, accessibility, and embodiment for over 15 years and have also been featured on some really big platforms like YUSA Today, Livestrong.com, Well and Good, and many other platforms. They were also once a Y leader and have presented in the past at national Y conferences. So really excited to have Laure on to share their perspective and experience with us all today around the topic of diversity and inclusion. I also want to just give the disclaimer that we are having this conversation around inclusion and won't even have time to get into any of the YMCA programming if we wanted to. But Laure, I'm going to kick it right over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you all today. And before I dive in, I know Ellie's going to, I don't know if it's already visible in the chat. I have a bunch of references. I am basically going to be a water bug skirting over the surface of a topic that has a lot of depth, a lot of layers, that has been the focus of a great deal of academic and professional research that a half hour doesn't allow for. I encourage you all to dive into the references and continue this line of questioning. But in respect for this time, I'm going to dive right in. Let's see, share. And there we go. So I'm going to, like I said, very quickly go over a general context of body diversity as it relates to sizeism, talk a little bit about the vocabulary I'll use, look at some of the health impacts of sizeism and fatphobia, some of the barriers we might face, specifically in movement spaces, invite some questions about what you might do at your branches and associations in the movement, and then transition to discussion. So with no further ado. So the context of body diversity and sizeism is very, very deep. It's in fact shaped a lot of the research around all things related to body size and shape. Of course, what questions we ask determines what answers we find. You will hear me through this presentation use the word fat. I have therefore found it helpful to say why I do that. It's in a very intentional word choice that I make for professional and advocacy reasons. It is not the only right choice. So I'm just going to walk you through my reasoning. The idea of larger bodied, bigger bodied, plus size, person of size, a lot of those that you might hear presume a point at which someone is like larger than what, bigger than what, above what size. It becomes a very vague term that doesn't really point to what we need to talk about. If we're talking about plus the size 2, it is plus size. It's not usually what we're talking about. So it doesn't have the accuracy that I look for in regards to academic and research related rigor. The terms thick and thick, depending on how it's spelled, I feel as a white person of Scottish descent are not mine to use without appropriation. I celebrate folks using them for themselves when they're applicable. The most nuanced and the hardest to kind of navigate is why I move away from the O words, or overweight and obese. These are used frequently in medical settings. In fact, they are diagnostic terms for which the implication is pathologizing naturally occurring body diversity. Terms that pathologize diversity are worth digging into a bit. When I dig into this, the history of the BMI equation, it was put together by a man named Adolphe Quetelet. He was a 19th century statistician from Belgium who was not a medical doctor. His goal was not to describe anything health related. His goal was to mathematically describe the optimal person so as to help identify the monstrosities in society who he encouraged incarcerating. He was the ideological grandfather of Nazism. And so this equation arose from a deeply racist and ableist context with a very clear social agenda of pathologizing and criminalizing body diversity. Therefore, I choose not to give credence to that aspect of the equation and the words that arise from it. I know that that can be a bit controversial. That's okay. But for me, I choose to use the word fat and talk about fat phobia and sizeism as an expression of deep gratitude to the fat advocates who came before me, many of whom have roots within other social justice movements. And yeah, there's a lot more that can go into with this, but like I said, respectful of time, maybe that'll come up in the Q&A or future discussions. But that's why you'll hear me use the word fat. I find it to be a more accurate and academically rigorous term, that when we undo sizeism, can be a neutral descriptive word. When we look at the overall context of fatnesia and sizeism, fatnesia being privilege plus sizeism, only one state has fully established non-discrimination protections based on body size diversity. That's Michigan. Some specific cities have some protective wording, but Michigan's the only state that offers this as a protected class. Implications in regards to discrimination in housing and employment are significant and very, very well documented. Ranging from people given two identical resumes with different photos attached, the thinner, applicants in this social science research get offered more jobs and at higher starting rates. Same things are seen in graduate school admissions. That there are very layered instances of discrimination against fat folks for which there are very limited protections. We get into just because it's not illegal doesn't mean it's ethical, and the impact is profoundly significant. Go into NAFA, they have a lot of information there in regards to sizeism and the legalities and history of discrimination. And of course, with this being Y specific, the concept of appearance and body type is listed on the diversity wheel as a dimension of diversity. It is one of the ones that it's worth sitting with the implications of saying this dimension of your diversity is okay as long as you're trying to be less of it. There's a message there that's just worth teasing apart and sitting with, if that were to be how we related to other dimensions of diversity, what might the emotional and human cost of that be? So there's setting some of the context for why this conversation is important. If we look at the health impacts of sizeism plus systemic privilege, we see a community of people with a significantly heightened and well-documented rates of social isolation, lower self-esteem, negative body image. You all can read. And there's a profound lack of access to movement guidance in regards to how fat bodies move and what they need in regards to adjusting form, leverage points. I'm a former competitive power lifter. There are nuances in adjusting to moving weight when your center of gravity is different and your mass is different that NSCA, ACSM, these certifying bodies do not adequately prepare personal trainers for. And so then oftentimes people seeking guidance are not able to access truly informed coaching. We're looking at Sizeism and fatness and fat phobia, and dieting itself are highly correlated with increased risks of eating disorders, which is particularly concerning when we look at the fact that anorexia nervosa has a higher per capita mortality rate than any other mental illness. This is really painful to sit with. And following weight loss surgeries, there is often decreased measures of mental health and wellness, including increased risk of suicidal ideation and suicidality. We already talked some about the disproportionate rates of underemployment and underemployment, resulting in being underinsured and uninsured. And then even if medical care can be accessed, it is well documented that over 70% of nurses surveyed have said that they would prefer not to touch fat clients, that doctors spend less time face-to-face with fat patients, run fewer diagnostic tests, and oftentimes lack even basic equipment for taking accurate measurements of like blood pressure, heart rate, that oftentimes very basic diagnostic tools and assessment tools are not available. And so, of course, when someone has additional intersecting identities, additional dimensions of diversity, all of these impacts of sizeism and fatnesia are amplified. A result of this is barriers in many ways. Structural and systemic ones. I'm talking about ones that would operate that way, even in the absence of any particular ill wish of harm. When something is so ingrained that even if an individual is aligned with body positivity, there are ways that they will be impacted that just are very expansive. Environmental, can someone access the space? When they're there, are they comfortable? Are they welcomed? Do they have a space to sit and exist and be respected and celebrated? Attitudinal, we're looking at both internalized and from the surrounding environment. Theoretical, we're talking about how do we approach information? When we look at the increasing rates of mortality and morbidity for fat folks, are we simply looking at size and saying, well, here's a correlation, therefore it's causality? Or are we looking at perhaps decades of medical trauma and resistance of the folks working within the medical fields and health and wellness fields to truly celebrate and honor fatness? The increased social isolation, all of those things that were on the previous slide are correlated with decreased health outcomes. So when we look at this information and data, are we assuming causality when there is a correlation? And are we looking at that with an open and tender human heart? An accidental internalized, it seeps in. It seeps in. And that's the truth of it. It's hard to have a body. It's hard to have a body in today's world in the best of circumstances. And the more marginalized dimensions of diversity you're layering on, the harder it is. And it's so hard, especially to not take it personally. In movement spaces in particular, there are going to be some areas where this can creep in. Is there adequate space between barriers? Where is the equipment? Is the equipment able to accommodate people of different dimensions and weights? Is it able to be adjusted? Who are we? Is there implicit bias at work when we are in charge of making hiring, training, and promotional decisions? when we are deciding what programs to develop and how to talk about them, how to market them. All of these things are opportunities for greater person-centered, affirming services within the movement. Everyone coming to us, being providers of health and wellness, are coming with a totality of life experiences, and any perceived barriers when doing something already hard. When it's something that is in our control, thinking about like, where are their solutions? This is all very solution oriented. This is a call upon, if you're working in a movement space, taking on that sense of personal responsibility and empowerment of, there are these opportunities for creating a space where not only people can come, but they want to. And once they're there, they're able to be celebrated and not just tolerated. And when we look at the solutions, I don't know what each of you face in your branches, in your departments, in your associations, but I encourage people to look at opportunities for taking action in every single one of these layers. Are there ways that we can look at some of our policies and find ways to more expansively relate to body size diversity? Are there ways that we can create messaging and spaces where people can see themselves represented and celebrated? Are we able to be mindful about how we talk about our own bodies and the bodies of others? Are we able to be a little bit more discerning about the interpretations we draw from the research that's out there related to body diversity? And are we able to be really humble and look at the ways we have internalized messages that pathologize body diversity and find alternative ways to soften to that judgment and open up a little bit to what we've internalized? Again, this can easily be a multi-hour long presentation. I wanted to leave a little bit of space to draw upon scenarios that, back when I was a Y employee, occurred at YMCAs, either I can vouch for that both of these situations happened. I changed identifying information, and I'd like to open them up for a little bit of thought, and then we'll go into Q&A. So scenario one, Jess, they, them, a member who is in recovery from an eating disorder, attends a beginner's aquafit class because they are looking for a low impact way to move gently without triggering their tendency to purge through overexercising. During this class, the instructor makes several encouraging comments about how what they're doing will help with weight loss and with firming up those unsightly bat wings on their arms. Some of the students smile at this, but Jess's eating disorder rises to the surface. After several more weeks of relapse into overexercising and a flare in their eating disorder symptomatology, they end up back in the hospital and never return to the Y. Actually, this happened years ago, and this person still isn't doing well. And I'm not saying that this is, again, causal, but really taking with some seriousness and humility how what we say and how we talk about bodies in our role has ripple effects. So not saying this person doesn't also have responsibility in their situation, but also like really owning our own responsibility to speak from a place of love and consider that. And a scenario two, Jen is an experienced athlete who happens to be fat. Whenever she goes to the Y to do her training, people who she doesn't even know interrupt her training time to give her a thumbs up and say how inspirational it is that she's there working out. It feels uncomfortable being tokenized and singled out for doing exactly what everyone else there is doing. People also often stop to encourage her to keep going. I know a friend who lost a lot of weight through exercise. Jen feels uncomfortable with this because she actually isn't trying to lose any weight. When she attends group exercise classes, the instructors offer excessive attention to her, resulting in her feeling even more singled out. Jen ends up feeling so isolated due to this frequent tokenization that she stops wanting to come around and ultimately cancels her membership. I wanted to leave with these why direct situations, hopefully as a bridge into Q&A that doesn't just have to be questions. I want to open this up to all of you and have some back and forth. I think that there's a lot of richness there. Ellie, any questions waiting?
Not that I've seen in the chat so far. I am going to stop recording so that we can all kind of speak freely without it ending up on YouTube. But thanks, Laura, for walking us through that content.
Absolutely.